He was the kind of man people back home would point to as a success story. 50 years old, a neatly pressed suit every morning, the kind of watch that caught the light in conference rooms. He owned a small but thriving logistics business in Dallas, had 2 kids in college, and a wife who liked to remind friends how hard he had worked to build it all. To neighbors, he was steady, predictable, a man who mowed his lawn on Saturdays and tithed to church on Sundays. But inside, he nursed the restless itch of someone who felt life was starting to pass him by. The routines had become too sharp, too predictable, and when a colleague suggested a trip through West Africa, part business scouting, part vacation, he didn't need much convincing. Ghana wasn't even the main stop on the itinerary. He was supposed to spend most of his time in Nigeria, maybe swing through Côte d'Ivoire, shake hands, see what opportunities were out there. Ghana was just a pause, a 2-night layover before the next leg of travel. But that stopover would be the one that carved his name into a very different kind of story. Accra hit him like a wall of heat and rhythm. The air smelled of grilled fish and dust, the streets alive with vendors calling out prices, radios spilling out high life and Afrobeats. Compared to the sterile glass offices of Dallas, it felt like stepping into another dimension, raw, chaotic, full of color. He checked into a modern hotel not far from the beach, the kind that catered to both expats and adventurous tourists, and wandered down to the market as the sun dropped into the Atlantic. That's when he noticed her. She was younger, mid-20s at most, standing at a stall draped in patterned cloth. Her features were striking. High cheekbones, skin smooth and radiant under the orange glow of a kerosene lamp. She didn't move with the bustle of the crowd. She stood almost still, eyes cutting through the noise, watching him as if she'd been expecting his arrival all along. He should have kept walking. He should have bought a trinket for his wife and gone back to the safety of his hotel bar. But when she smiled, a slow, knowing smile that curled at the edges, his feet betrayed him. Her name, or at least the name she gave him, was Amma. She spoke English with the soft cadence of someone educated, though her laughter came in sharp bursts that felt untamed. They talked over roasted plantains and bottled beer, her questions gentle but direct. Was he married? Did he travel often? Why had he come to Ghana? He found himself telling her more than he should have, about his children, about the weight of responsibility, about how sometimes he wished he could just disappear into another life. She listened without judgment, her dark eyes reflecting the glow of passing headlights. When she slipped her hand into his, it felt inevitable. He led her back through the narrow streets, heart thudding with the reckless thrill of a man doing exactly what he swore he never would. At the hotel, the receptionist looked away, pretending not to notice. Upstairs, the room filled with the hum of the air conditioner and the scent of her perfume, something floral and heavy that clung to the curtains. He told himself it was just a single night, a private indulgence no one would ever know about. But somewhere in the middle of all, when her hair brushed across his chest and she whispered words in a language he didn't understand, a sliver of unease slid into his mind. Still, when morning came, she was gone, leaving only the impression of her body on the sheets and the faint perfume lingering in the air. He stood by the window, staring down at the busy street, a wave of guilt crashing over him. He promised himself this was buried now, sealed away. He showered, dressed, and caught his flight, carrying the memory like contraband hidden in his chest. Back in Dallas, everything fell back into place as if nothing had happened. His wife greeted him with a kiss at the airport. His son called for money for textbooks. His daughter sent him photos from her sorority event. He unpacked, slipped the gifts he'd bought into their hands, and returned to the office Monday morning to catch up on emails. No one suspected a thing. He told himself it had just been a moment, a foolish, selfish moment left behind an ocean away. What he didn't know then, As he smoothed his tie in a mirror and forced himself to smile at his reflection, was that the story wasn't over. The trip hadn't been a harmless detour. It was the beginning of something that would spread beyond his control, something his wealth, his business contacts, and even the best American hospitals would not be able to save him from. In Ghana, he had shaken hands with temptation. In Dallas, he would soon discover the price. Back home, the days slipped into their familiar rhythm, and he almost convinced himself nothing had changed. He was back in Dallas, back to his corner office with the framed diplomas and the smell of strong coffee in the mornings. He shook hands with clients, nodded at his employees, laughed with his wife at the dinner table. To anyone looking in from the outside, he was the same man who had left on business just a few weeks earlier. But late at night, when the house was quiet, he felt a faint sting he couldn't ignore. At first, it was just a twinge, a little burn when he used the bathroom, the kind of irritation he assumed came from jet lag and the wear of travel. He told himself it would pass. Maybe he'd picked up a mild infection, nothing a few over-the-counter creams couldn't handle. He wasn't about to sit his wife down and confess that during his trip he'd broken every vow he'd ever made. He carried the secret like a weight on his chest, determined to bury it deeper. But within days, the irritation sharpened into pain. He noticed redness, then a raw soreness that made him wince. In the shower, he turned his body away from the mirror, too ashamed to look. He typed "burning pain after travel Africa" into his phone, scrolling through endless medical blogs that only heightened his panic. He bought ointments at the pharmacy, careful to pick self-checkout so the clerk wouldn't glance at the packaging. He dabbed the cream on at night, whispering prayers that no one would notice his restless shifting in bed. Then came the smell, subtle at first, like something metallic, a faint tang he thought he imagined. But by the second week, there was no mistaking it, a sour, rotten odor that clung to his sheets. His wife wrinkled her nose one morning and asked if something had spoiled in the trash. He laughed it off, hard hammering, and hurried to change the linens before she came back upstairs. That evening, he sat alone in his office with the door locked, trying to clean himself with paper towels, gagging at the stench. For the first time in years, fear overpowered pride. By the third week, the lesions appeared. Small at first, blister-like sores that bled when touched. He wanted to scream, but instead he pressed tissues against the wounds and whispered, "Please, God, not this." He wore loose pants, skipped workouts, avoided intimacy with his wife entirely. He claimed he was tired, that the long trip had thrown off his body clock. But the truth was uglier. Every step hurt, every movement reminded him that something inside him was breaking down. His family noticed. At dinner one night, his daughter asked why he looked pale. His son teased him about losing weight. His wife suggested a checkup, but he brushed her off, insisting it was just stress. Deep down, he knew he was running out of time. The foul decay grew stronger, impossible to mask. He kept windows open in his car, lit candles in his office, sprayed cologne before crawling into bed. None of it helped. The collapse came one Saturday morning. He tried to get out of bed, but the pain was so sharp it dropped him to his knees. His wife rushed in and gasped, finally seeing what he had been hiding. The sheets were stained, the smell undeniable. She screamed for their son to call 911. He curled up on the floor, sobbing, unable to speak as paramedics burst into the room. His wife's face hovered above him, twisted in a mix of horror, rage, and betrayal. At the hospital, doctors swarmed him with questions. When did the symptoms begin? Had he traveled recently? Had he been exposed to anyone sick? He stammered half-truths, dodging the one detail he couldn't admit, that all of this had started the night he gave in to temptation in Accra. His wife sat in the corner, arms crossed tight against her chest, eyes brimming with tears. For her, The infection wasn't just a medical mystery. It was a confession written across his body. The initial tests baffled the physicians. They suspected a severe bacterial infection, maybe even necrotizing fasciitis. They pumped him with antibiotics, ordered scans, and kept him under close watch. Nurses whispered in the hallways about the smell, how they'd never seen tissue break down like that so quickly. One doctor muttered that it looked like something eating him alive. Meanwhile, the news began to trickle into the public. Hospital staff leaked fragments of the bizarre case to friends, who spread it online. Posts popped up on forums. Dallas businessman hospitalized with strange infection after Africa trip. Neighbors texted each other, curious why an ambulance had come to the house. Within days, reporters were circling, sniffing out a story that was darker than any of them realized. Lying in his hospital bed, tubes snaking into his arms, he realized the secret was no longer his to control. His body had betrayed him, his lies had unraveled, and the night he thought he'd left behind in Ghana had followed him home. The pain was unbearable, but the shame cut deeper. For the first time in his carefully managed life, he wasn't in charge of the story anymore. The story was in charge of him. They wheeled him into a sterile white room that smelled of antiseptic, but the sharp chemical tang couldn't mask the odor already coming off his body. Nurses wore masks, though he could see in their eyes the struggle not to flinch. The doctors huddled around his bed, their voices clipped and urgent, each order overlapping the next. Blood work, cultures, immediate 4 antibiotics. His wife stood near the doorway, rigid as stone, refusing to look directly at him. It wasn't just the smell, it was the truth she could no longer deny. He had brought something home that didn't belong here, and it was killing him. The initial labs came back quickly. High white blood cell counts, markers of infection off the charts. But the organism itself was elusive. The cultures grew fast, spreading like wildfire on the plates. One resident described it as aggressive, eating the medium like it was alive. They suspected a necrotizing infection, the kind usually triggered by rare strains of bacteria in tropical climates. Flesh-eating, a phrase no family wants to hear. The head doctor explained it with clinical detachment, but the words hit like a hammer. Your husband has contracted a highly unusual bacterial strain. It is causing rapid tissue necrosis. We've never seen this exact profile before in the United States. His wife gasped, finally breaking her silence. What does that even mean? Can you fix him? The doctor hesitated, which was answer enough. Overnight, his condition worsened. The infection spread beyond the initial sores, creeping into the groin, the thighs, turning patches of skin black. Nurses checked his vitals every hour, jotting notes while their eyes lingered just a beat too long, betraying the unease they felt. His children arrived, both pale and terrified, clutching each other in the waiting room. When they were allowed in, his daughter nearly fainted at the sight of him. His son muttered under his breath, "Jesus, Dad, what did you do?" The rumors outside the hospital walls began to grow louder. A local reporter, tipped off by a staffer, wrote an article. Dallas businessman hospitalized with mysterious rotting infection after trip abroad. The headline spread across social media, attaching his name to a story he'd never escape. Colleagues called the house, neighbors whispered, church members exchanged glances on Sunday morning. Within hours, strangers online were speculating about African curses, voodoo, punishment for infidelity. Back in the hospital, doctors escalated their approach. They prepped him for surgery, explaining that to save his life, they might have to remove infected tissue. Debridement, they called it, slicing away rot to preserve what remained. He signed the consent forms with shaking hands, sweat dripping down his forehead. He closed his eyes as they wheeled him away, haunted by the memory of Alma's eyes that night in Ghana. the way she whispered words he hadn't understood. Had it been a curse? Or just bad luck? The operating room lights were blinding, the cold bite of anesthesia seeping into his veins. When he woke, he was missing pieces of himself. The surgeons had cut aggressively, removing skin and tissue, leaving behind bandaged wounds that seeped fluids through the gauze. He groaned, begging for answers, but the doctors offered none he wanted to hear. "We've slowed the spread," one surgeon said carefully, "but we can't promise it won't return. We're dealing with something unfamiliar, something we don't fully understand." His wife finally spoke to him that night. Her voice trembled, half fury, half grief. "You cheated on me. Don't even bother denying it. Whatever this is, you brought it back in your body. You've humiliated us, destroyed everything." He tried to reach for her hand, but she pulled away, eyes glassy with tears. "I'll stay for the kids' sake, but don't you dare think I forgive you." The words gutted him more deeply than the surgeon's knives. The next morning, infectious disease specialists flew in from Houston. They donned hazmat-style gear, studied the cultures under microscopes, and whispered about strains found only in certain pockets of West Africa. They believed it was a variant of Clostridium or Vibrio, bacteria that thrive in warm, humid climates. But this strain was different, more virulent, more destructive. The lead specialist admitted to the family, "We may be looking at a new pathogen altogether." His case quickly became a teaching tool. Medical students filed in, scribbling notes as he lay half awake, ashamed to be studied like a specimen. News cameras staked out the hospital parking lot, filming any relative who dared to walk past. Talk shows debated whether this was divine punishment, reckless behavior, or a terrifying medical mystery. His name trended on Twitter under the hashtag #GonaCurse. Every beep of the monitors reminded him that he wasn't in control anymore. His body had become a battleground. At night, fever dreams consumed him. Visions of Alma's face, of whispers in the market, of shadows pressing against his chest. He woke drenched in sweat, certain she had marked him, that he was living out a curse stitched into his flesh. The doctors could cut, medicate, analyze, but none of them could explain the why. Meanwhile, his family fractured under the weight of public shame. His daughter refused to return to the hospital, too embarrassed by the stares from classmates who had seen the headlines. His son barely spoke, glaring at him with a mix of pity and resentment. His wife slept in the waiting room, but never entered his room at night, as if proximity itself would taint her. He was still alive, but in every way that mattered, marriage, reputation, dignity, he was already dying. The infection slowed, but didn't stop. Each time the doctors thought they'd gained ground, another patch of tissue darkened. They whispered about amputation, about removing entire sections of his lower body to keep him breathing. He stared at the ceiling, tears running down his temples, wondering how a single night in Ghana had spiraled into this nightmare. He thought of the man he had been, proud, respected, untouchable, and compared it to the broken figure on the hospital bed. Somewhere between the beeping monitors and the hushed voices, a cruel realization took hold. This wasn't just a medical case anymore. It was a spectacle. His suffering had become a story, dissected by strangers, broadcast for the world. And no matter how the doctors fought, no matter how many surgeries he endured, he understood something deeper, that the rot consuming his body was only part of the story. The rest was the rot of secrets, lies, and shame, spreading just as fast. The story burst out of the hospital walls like wildfire. One leaked photo, him on a gurney, face pale, eyes swollen with fever, was enough to send tabloids into overdrive. Headlines screamed across social media feeds. Dallas businessman rotting from mysterious African disease. Cable networks ran segments with ominous background music, flashing his smiling corporate headshot alongside grainy images of Ghana's crowded markets. In less than 48 hours, he wasn't just a patient. He was a cautionary tale, a grotesque punchline, and for some, living proof of supernatural retribution. Talk radio lit up with callers eager to share theories. One woman insisted she'd read about curses cast by Ghanaian witches, designed to punish Western men who preyed on local women. Another caller swore it was a bioweapon, some government experiment gone wrong. A pastor in Alabama thundered from the pulpit that this was divine punishment for adultery. On Twitter, the hashtag Ghana Curse trended alongside memes mocking his condition. Some were cruelly creative, depicting his face photoshopped onto rotting fruit. Others framed it as a morality tale. Wealthy American man, full of pride, brought low by temptation. But alongside the mockery, fear seeped in. Parents asked if their kids could catch it at school. Airlines fielded calls from nervous passengers demanding to know if flights from West Africa were safe. The Centers for Disease Control dispatched experts to Dallas, staging press conferences that only fueled the hysteria. They assured the public the infection wasn't airborne, that it required direct exposure. Still, their guarded tone did little to settle nerves. When reporters asked if this was a new disease, the lead CDC official said carefully, "We are investigating all possibilities." It was enough to make headlines. CDC won't rule out new flesh-eating pathogen. At the hospital, the frenzy outside trickled into the ward. Security guards had to push back camera crews. Nurses complained about being stalked on their commute home. His wife couldn't walk to the cafeteria without strangers shoving phones at her face. The shame burned hotter than the fluorescent lights. She wanted to scream, "This is my husband dying, not your entertainment." But her fury was tangled with something darker, betrayal. Each headline was also a reminder of what he'd done, the choice that had brought them all here. Doctors tried to keep the narrative grounded in science. They explained the infection was likely a tropical strain of necrotizing bacteria, introduced through a cut or abrasion. They emphasized it was rare, but not supernatural. Yet every interview seemed to stoke more speculation. Online forums spun elaborate theories that the Ghanaian girl had been part of a cult, that she carried an ancestral curse passed down through generations. YouTubers posted hour-long breakdowns with titles like "The Rotting Man of Dallas," "Coincidence or Curse." Inside his hospital room, he watched fragments of this circus on the TV bolted to the wall. Between doses of morphine, he stared at anchors dissecting his life, commentators who didn't even know his name until last week. He wanted to shout that he wasn't a villain, that he was just a man who made one reckless choice. But he knew it wouldn't matter. The story wasn't his anymore. It belonged to the world. The infection itself was a brutal backdrop to the drama. Despite aggressive surgeries, patches of gangrenous flesh kept spreading. They pumped him full of antibiotics, some so experimental they required special clearance. But the results were mixed, the bacteria resistant and unpredictable. His doctors debated whether this was something entirely new, a hybrid strain forged in the humid tropics, or simply an extreme mutation of a known organism. Meanwhile, rumors about Alma, the mysterious woman in Ghana, gained momentum. A British tabloid sent reporters to Accra to comb the markets. They claimed locals told stories of a young woman whose lovers never returned the same. Some swore she was cursed. Others said she was cursed and a carrier of disease, a vessel of vengeance disguised in beauty. The paper splashed her alleged photo across its front page, though no one could confirm if the woman pictured was truly Alma. Still, the damage was done. For millions of readers, she became the phantom villain of the tale. His family fractured further under the glare. His daughter refused to log into social media, horrified by the memes. His son snapped at reporters, shouting, "Leave us alone." His wife stayed icy, her silence louder than anger. When she did speak, it was only to the doctors, demanding updates in clipped tones. To him, she offered nothing but averted eyes. He tried to apologize once, voice hoarse, but she cut him off. "Save your strength. It doesn't matter anymore." By the 4th week of hospitalization, his case had spiraled into a global story. International outlets debated whether Western medicine could contain such an infection. Conspiracy sites claimed it was proof of biospirits or African mysticism. Ghana's tourism board even issued a statement denying supernatural activity in the country, trying to protect its reputation. But the more officials tried to tamp it down, the more the story swelled. He wasn't just a patient anymore. He was a symbol, twisted and reshaped depending on who told the story. For some, he was a fool. For others, a victim. For many, a warning. Lying in his hospital bed, body carved by scalpels and ravaged by bacteria, he realized something cruel. No matter how this ended, he would never again be remembered as the man he was. Not as a businessman, not as a father, not as a husband. Only as the man who slept with a stranger in Ghana and came home to rot. While his body withered under the bright lights of a Dallas hospital, another hunt began thousands of miles away. Reporters weren't content with speculation. They wanted a face, a name, a villain to pin to the story. Flights were booked, cameras packed, and soon journalists from London, New York, and Lagos were pushing their way through the noisy markets of Accra. They all had the same question on their lips. Who was the woman? In Makola Market, a reporter from a British tabloid waved a photograph, an artist's sketch based on the businessman's half-delirious description. Some vendors shrugged, others laughed nervously. But whispers started to ripple. A few nodded slowly, muttering a single name, Alma. She was said to drift between stalls at dusk, appearing when she pleased, then vanishing into the maze of alleys. Some swore she lived nearby. Others claimed she had no fixed home at all. One old woman spat on the ground, saying Alma was a shadow, a girl marked by spirits. Local journalists joined the search, eager to prove or disprove the foreign narrative. They tracked rumors that Alma had once been a barmaid in OSU, known for her beauty and sharp tongue. A former coworker recalled how men seemed to fall hard for her, but just as quickly, they disappeared, moving away, losing jobs, falling ill. Bad luck followed her like smoke, the woman said, lowering her voice as though speaking the words might invite misfortune. The Ghanaian Ministry of Health, stung by international headlines about African curses, launched its own inquiry. Officials insisted on science, not superstition. They gathered doctors familiar with tropical diseases, pointing out that necrotizing bacteria were well documented in the region's humid climate. Yet even they couldn't ignore how the story had taken root. The image of Alma as a mysterious carrier of death was more compelling than any medical paper. Back in Dallas, news of the search reached the hospital. His wife watched clips of reporters wandering Accra, interviewing fishermen and priests. She sat stiffly in the waiting room, lips pressed tight. To her, it was grotesque. Strangers digging through the ruins of her marriage, chasing the ghost of the woman who had destroyed it all. She didn't care whether Alma was real, cursed, or just unlucky. Her husband had made a choice, and this was the price. But to him, lying in bed with tubes snaking into his arms, the search consumed him. Each night, he asked the nurses if there was news. In feverish whispers, he begged them to tell him what they'd found. Did they see her? Did she mean to do this? He wasn't just desperate for a cure anymore. He wanted a story that absolved him, that turned his betrayal into something beyond his control. In Ghana, the trail grew stranger. A local healer claimed Alma had visited him years before, complaining of nightmares and unexplained fevers. He had performed rituals, but said she carried something stronger than herbs could touch. Another man swore she had once been married, but her husband had died mysteriously within a year. Whether coincidence or curse, each account deepened the myth. Some journalists leaned into the sensational, running headlines like the Black Widow of Accra. Others pushed back, accusing Western media of demonizing an African woman to entertain audiences abroad. A Ghanaian columnist wrote, "We have bacteria here, not witches. The true curse is ignorance." But the rebuttals were drowned out by the louder, uglier narrative, one that fit too neatly into the viral frenzy. The CDC, pressured by both governments, sent a small delegation to Accra. They tested water sources, swabbed market stalls, interviewed doctors at local clinics. Their findings were clinical. Strains of bacteria similar to what was ravaging the businessman existed in the soil and rivers. Contamination could easily happen through the smallest cut. It was science. It was explainable. But in the court of public opinion, the verdict had already been delivered. Alma was the face of the curse. Back in Dallas, his health yo-yoed. One day he seemed stable, whispering weak jokes to the nurses. The next, his fever spiked, and doctors talked grimly about sepsis. His wife refused to let the children visit anymore, saying they had seen enough. Alone in the sterile room, he replayed every second of that night in Ghana. The glow of the lamp on her skin, the way her hair brushed his chest, the foreign words he barely remembered. What if they had meant more than pillow talk? What if she had known all along what she was giving him? Meanwhile, the media circus tightened its grip. Talk shows staged debates between infectious disease experts and self-proclaimed spiritualists. One viral clip showed a televangelist declaring, "This is what happens when men stray." The curse is not in Ghana. The curse is in the sin. Twitter exploded, half mocking, half agreeing. In Ghana, Alma herself remained elusive. Some swore she had fled to another city. Others claimed she was still walking the markets, smiling faintly at the chaos her name had caused. Without proof, she became whatever people needed her to be, a villain, a victim, a myth. The businessman, trapped in his hospital bed, knew the truth was slipping away from him. Science might eventually explain what was happening to his body, but the world didn't want science. The world wanted a story. And in that story, he wasn't a respected entrepreneur, a husband, a father. He was the man who met a girl in Ghana and brought home a curse. The decision came on a grim Tuesday morning. A team of surgeons gathered around his bed, faces drawn tight, clipboards in hand. The infection had spread despite every antibiotic cocktail they'd thrown at it. Each day the necrosis crept farther, chewing through tissue like fire through dry grass. There was no way to stop it without taking drastic measures. The lead surgeon spoke gently, but the words landed like blades. To save your life, we'll have to remove what's left. Amputation of the affected tissue, possibly extensive. He closed his eyes, shame flooding every nerve. They weren't talking about a limb. They were talking about the part of him that for 50 years had defined his pride as a man, his virility, his power. The part of him that had betrayed his vows that night in Ghana. Now was rotten, blackened, a liability that threatened his very heartbeat. When they wheeled him into the operating room, the fluorescent lights above him blurred. He tried to cling to memories of his children's laughter, of Sunday barbecues in the backyard, of his wife's smile before it hardened into stone. The anesthesiologist pressed a mask over his face, and his last thought before slipping under was of Alma, her dark eyes, the words she whispered into his ear. Hours later, he woke to pain, raw and searing. His groin was swaddled in thick dressings, tubes draining fluids into clear containers. The surgeons hovered nearby, voices hushed but relieved. They had removed the infected tissue, they said, but there was no guarantee the bacteria wouldn't return. They would monitor, test, cut again if they had to. He nodded weakly, though the truth landed heavy. He was alive, but he was no longer whole. The news leaked within hours. By evening, cable news anchors were breathlessly reporting the radical surgery. Online, the cruelty spiked. Memes exploded across Twitter and TikTok. Cartoons of scissors, captions mocking his downfall. Some treated it as justice, others as dark comedy. He lay in bed, scrolling through the noise until his wife snatched the phone away, disgust etched into every line of her face. She couldn't contain her bitterness anymore. One night, standing at the edge of his hospital bed, she whispered with venom, "You threw away everything for one night. Now look at you. Look at what's left." Her words carved deeper than any scalpel. He wanted to beg for forgiveness, but the shame sat like lead on his tongue. She turned and walked out, leaving him alone with the machines that beeped in rhythm with his failing dignity. The doctors pressed on with their science. Cultures revealed an exotic strain of bacteria related to Clostridium perfringens, but mutated, unusually virulent. It thrived in oxygen-starved tissue, releasing toxins that liquefied muscle and skin. They mapped its genetic code, marveling at its uniqueness. But for him, their curiosity was a curse. Each discussion of his case felt like another nail in his coffin, another reminder that his body had become an exhibit, not a man. Medical journals began drafting articles. One labeled him Case Zero of a new tropical variant. Another speculated about environmental reservoirs in Ghanaian soil. The academic language stripped him of identity, reducing him to a 50-year-old American male patient presenting with rapidly progressive necrotizing infection. He was no longer a husband or father, just data, a subject to be studied. Meanwhile, the myth of Alma hardened. Tabloids painted her as a temptress who had knowingly infected him. Preachers thundered about her as an agent of Satan. Ghanaian officials denounced the portrayal, but whispers persisted. Some locals claimed she was still seen wandering the markets, untouched, beautiful, untouchable. Whether she was real, cursed, or just unlucky didn't matter anymore. In the global imagination, she was the face of the curse. His children stopped visiting. His daughter, humiliated by classmates' jokes, avoided the hospital altogether. His son came once more, standing stiff at the foot of the bed, eyes full of contempt. "You ruined us," he muttered before walking out. The words echoed long after the door clicked shut. In the darkest hours of night, fevered dreams clawed at him. He saw himself back in that hotel room, Alma's hair brushing across his chest, her lips moving with words he still couldn't translate. In the dream, those words curdled into laughter, and he woke drenched in sweat, clutching at the bandages that marked his mutilation. The surgeons returned days later with more bad news. Despite the operation, signs of infection remained. Red streaks traced his thighs, his fever spiked, and his blood work screamed sepsis. They debated whether further amputation might buy him more time, taking muscle, even bone. He stared at them in horror. "What kind of life would that be?" he whispered. The doctors had no answer. Outside his room, the circus rolled on. News vans idled in the parking lot. Commentators argued on TV. Hashtags trended. Was he a victim of a bizarre medical tragedy? Or was he the architect of his own downfall, cursed by lust and arrogance? Everyone had an opinion. No one asked what he thought. Lying in the sterile bed, tubes and wires binding him like a puppet, he understood at last. He would never outlive this story. Even if he survived, Even if the infection was somehow beaten back, he would forever be remembered as the man who traveled to Ghana, betrayed his family, and returned home rotting. Science might explain it, doctors might catalog it, but the world would always prefer the curse. And so, staring at the ceiling, he whispered into the dark, not to God, not to his wife, not even to his children. He whispered to Alma, the phantom who had begun it all. Why me? But the silence that answered was heavier than any voice. He survived, but barely. After weeks of surgeries, rounds of antibiotics, and nights that blurred into fever-soaked delirium, the infection finally slowed. The doctors called it a miracle, though their voices were flat, exhausted. What remained of him was bandaged, fragile, hollowed out. He was no longer the man who had boarded a plane to Ghana with a crisp suit and a confident stride. He was a shell, alive, yes, but carved down to the bone by both disease and disgrace. When he was discharged, it wasn't home he returned to. His wife refused. "You can't come back here," she told him in the hospital parking lot, her arms crossed, her face set like stone. "The kids won't have it, and neither will I." She drove away without looking back, leaving him slumped in a wheelchair as orderlies loaded him into a transport van bound for a rehab facility. His house, his family, his marriage, all gone in the shadow of that night in Accra. The facility was quiet, sterile, filled with other broken bodies. Men who had lost limbs to diabetes, veterans with missing legs, stroke survivors learning to walk again. He fit right in, yet none of them carried the weight of a viral infamy. He could feel the whispers follow him down the hall, the way nurses exchanged glances when his name came up. One orderly, bolder than most, finally asked, "You're that guy, aren't you? The Ghana curse guy?" He didn't answer, just turned his wheelchair toward the window and stared at the parking lot. Meanwhile, the world outside hadn't moved on. Documentaries aired with ominous titles like Vacation Curse, The Rotting Man of Dallas. Podcasts dissected his downfall, mixing medical jargon with tabloid gossip. His photo, before and after, circulated endlessly. Once a polished businessman, now gaunt and gray, bandaged and broken. For strangers, his suffering was content. For him, it was a prison he could never escape. The CDC eventually published its findings. The bacteria was real, not supernatural, a rare necrotizing strain found in Ghanaian soil and water, transmitted through microscopic cuts. It was science, ugly but explainable. But by then, the myth had outpaced the truth. People didn't want pathogens and lab reports. They wanted curses, morality tales, the thrill of believing something darker than microbes had struck him down. In Ghana, the name Alma lingered like smoke. Reporters never confirmed her existence, never found proof she had infected anyone else. Some locals insisted she was a real woman, unfairly demonized. Others leaned into the legend, whispering that she still walked the markets at dusk, her beauty untouched, her smile carrying ruin. She became folklore, the kind of story mothers told their sons when warning them against reckless desire. He tried, in the quiet hours of rehab, to piece together a life from the wreckage. He thought about calling his children, but when he reached for the phone, his hands shook. He thought about returning to his business, but the company had already been sold off by his partners, desperate to salvage what they could. Even old friends kept their distance, unwilling to be associated with his scandal. He was alone with his thoughts, haunted by the smell of antiseptic and the memory of Alma's whisper. Sometimes at night, he rolled his wheelchair to the courtyard and stared at the stars. He wondered if Alma was looking at the same sky, half a world away. Did she think of him? Did she know what had happened? Or was he just another faceless traveler, another body in her trail of myths and rumors? He would never know. The press still called, of course. Offers for interviews book deals, TV specials. He rejected them all. What was there left to say? The world had already written his story, twisted it into the shape they wanted. He was the man who slept with a Ghanaian girl and came home to rot. That was all he would ever be. In the end, his name faded into the background noise of other scandals, other tragedies. But the phrase "Ghana curse" lived on, a shorthand in headlines whenever someone wanted to mix lust, travel, and danger into a cautionary tale. His life had become a parable, stripped of nuance, packaged for clicks and whispers. He sat in that courtyard one evening, the Texas sun dipping low, shadows stretching long across the concrete. His body was weak, his future uncertain, but one truth remained sharp as a blade. A single night of temptation had unraveled everything. Wealth, reputation, family, dignity all gone. The infection had eaten more than flesh. It had devoured his life. And somewhere, in the echo of his memory, Alma's voice lingered. Not words he could understand, but a murmur that curled around his thoughts like smoke. He couldn't tell if it was real or just the sound of his own guilt repeating endlessly. That was the curse. Not bacteria, not folklore. The curse was living long enough to remember everything.